feeling underestimated. Listen to this story. On a tranquil hilltop farm bathed in golden sunlight stood a modest chicken coop surrounded by lush greenery. Among its feathery inhabitants lived Gus, the rooster, a proud figure with shimmering red plumage and a comb that stood tall like a crown. Every morning, Gus would take his place atop the coop and let out a thunderous crow that echoed across the farm. To him, his morning call was not just a duty. It was a proclamation of his importance, a signal to all creatures that the day had begun because of him. The other animals admired Gus from afar, but rarely spoke to him. His confidence, bordering on arrogance, kept them at a distance. Gus preferred it that way. He believed his role as the farm's herald elevated him above the mundane concerns of others. His heart swelled with pride as he watched the sun crest the horizon, feeling as though his voice had pulled it into the sky. However, life in the coop was not without its challenges. The hens worked tirelessly to keep their nests warm, while the chicks stumbled through the dirt, learning to find their footing. The farm dogs, sheep, and even the gentle cows all contributed to the harmony of the farm. Gus, meanwhile, basked in his solitary role, certain that his song was the linchpin of it all. In the quiet hours after sunrise, while others were busy with their tasks, Gus would perch on the fence, gazing across the fields. He told himself that his distance was necessary after all. A leader should not mingle too closely with his followers. Yet, deep down, a faint whisper of doubt stirred. Was his role truly as grand as he believed, or was he merely filling his days with noise? One morning, as Gus strutted through the yard, he overheard soft murmurs from the hens. "Gus thinks his crowing is enough," one whispered. "But what good is his voice if it doesn't warm our hearts? He never helps, never asks how we're doing." The words stung more than Gus cared to admit. Still, he brushed them off, thinking, "They don't understand the weight of my responsibilities." Gus believed that being admired was all a leader needed. He had no idea how much that belief would soon be challenged. As the days rolled on, Gus continued his routine, shaking off the whispers he had overheard. Yet, a seed of unease had been planted in his mind. Whenever he climbed to the top of the coop to crow, he couldn't help but glance at the hens below. Were they listening to him with admiration, as he always imagined, or were their minds elsewhere? The farm bustled with life in the mornings. The hens clucked as they laid eggs, the sheep bleated lazily in the pasture, and the dogs patrolled the grounds, ensuring the safety of the smaller animals. Gus, perched high above it all, felt disconnected. He convinced himself it was the burden of leadership being apart, being above. But a growing loneliness gnawed at his heart. The animals of the farm continued their work, sharing laughs and companionship in between their chores. Gus, however, remained an observer. He saw the sheep gather under the shade of the old oak tree, sharing gentle nudges and soft baas. The pigs wallowed together, their snorts blending in a symphony of carefree camaraderie. Even the hens, busy with their endless work, exchanged stories and clucked in unison when the chicks scampered around them. In contrast, Gus was alone. He had long believed his crowing was enough to cement his place as the farm's leader. Yet, he had no companions to confide in, no one who truly sought his presence beyond the function of his voice. His days felt heavy with silence, except for his own echoes. Then came the whispers again. This time, they weren't hushed murmurs. The hens clucked openly as Gus strutted past. All he does is crow and pose. Does he even care about the rest of us? Maybe he thinks we're here to admire him, another hen scoffed. The words were sharper than Gus had anticipated. His feathers ruffled, and he turned toward them. But as he opened his beak to speak, no words came. What could he say? That he was more than his crow? Did they even need to hear him? Or was their disappointment rooted in something deeper? Gus fled the yard, finding solace near the edge of the farm, where the tall grasses swayed in the wind. He tried to convince himself that the hens were wrong, that their words stemmed from jealousy or misunderstanding. But as he watched the farm from a distance, he saw what he had been blind to for so long. The animals worked together, laughed together, struggled together. None of them seemed to need him the way he had convinced himself they did. The farm thrived not because of him, but because of the unity among its creatures. For the first time, Gus began to wonder if his role was truly as vital as he had believed. That night, as the farm settled into its usual calm, Gus stood on the roof of the coop, staring at the stars. For the first time in his life, his crow at dawn felt like a task rather than a triumph. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the farm, a sudden shriek pierced the usual harmony. The sky darkened momentarily as a menacing falcon swooped low over the yard. Its sharp talons gleamed, and its screeches sent the smaller animals into a panic. Chickens scattered, their wings flapping wildly, while the sheep and pigs huddled close in confusion. From his perch atop the coop, Gus saw the chaos unfold. Instinctively, he let out a deafening crow, hoping to rally the animals and scare off the intruder. "Take cover. Stay together," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the yard. But his cries went unheard amidst the frantic clucking and bleating. The falcon struck with precision, diving toward a group of chicks that scrambled to hide beneath their mother. In a desperate attempt to protect her brood, the mother hen leaped forward, her wings spread wide. Gus watched in horror as the falcon's talons raked her back, leaving her injured but alive. The predator retreated to a distant tree, its eyes still locked on the yard. The farm was in disarray. The hens clucked nervously as they gathered their chicks, checking for injuries. The sheep remained frozen, their eyes darting toward the skies. The dogs barked furiously, chasing shadows that no longer held the falcon. In the middle of it all, Gus stood paralyzed. His mighty crow, the very sound he believed commanded the farm, had failed to protect them. That evening, a heavy silence hung over the coop. The injured hen rested in the corner, her feathers ruffled and her spirit shaken. The other animals murmured among themselves, their gazes occasionally flickering toward Gus. Their expressions were not of admiration, but of doubt. "Where was he?" whispered one of the hens. "What good is his crow if it doesn't protect us?" Gus pretended not to hear, but their words echoed in his mind. For the first time, his pride felt hollow. He had always believed his voice was enough, that it was his crowing that held the farm together. Now he realized how little he had done to truly earn the trust or respect of the animals around him. Guilt crept into his chest, squeezing his heart tight. "What kind of leader am I?" he thought. The falcon's attack had exposed his greatest fear, that his role was insignificant. For all his noise and posturing, he had been unable to make a difference when it truly mattered. Unable to face the others, Gus retreated to a secluded corner of the yard as night fell. He gazed at his reflection in a puddle, the water shimmering under the moonlight. The rooster staring back at him seemed smaller, less grand than he had ever imagined. As the first stars began to twinkle above, Gus whispered to himself, "Perhaps they're right. Maybe I'm not the leader I thought I was." The admission felt like a blow to his very essence. His confidence, once as sturdy as the coop he ruled, began to crack. The farm had survived the falcon's attack, but the scars it left behind were not only on the hen. Gus's pride had suffered a wound far deeper, one that would force him to confront the truth about himself. The following days were marked by a somber quiet. The animals avoided Gus, their gazes lingering just long enough to convey their disappointment before turning away. The wounded hen, her feathers patched and her spirit dulled, stayed close to her chicks, refusing to acknowledge Gus's presence. Gus, for his part, felt as though the weight of the entire farm had settled on his chest. He spent most of his time away from the others, perched on the fence at the edge of the yard, staring out at the endless fields. The once vibrant Rooster, who used to crow with unwavering pride, now found his voice caught in his throat every morning. His mind churned with questions. Why had my crow failed? Why didn't they listen? Am I truly a leader if my voice holds no meaning? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the farm in hues of amber and gold, Gus found himself wandering aimlessly. The usual hum of camaraderie among the animals seemed distant, almost foreign to him. He noticed the hens gathered in a circle, their quiet clucks blending with the soft rustling of leaves. The sheep grazed in the pasture, their movements synchronized as though guided by some invisible force of unity. But Gus was alone. Unable to bear the isolation any longer, he perched himself on a low branch of the old oak tree and gazed at the farm below. The memories of the falcon's attack replayed in his mind, the chaos, the fear, the injured hen. No matter how much he tried to push them away, the images clung to him, gnawing at his conscience. It wasn't enough, he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. My crow wasn't enough. For the first time, Gus allowed himself to question everything he had believed about leadership. He had always thought it was about being heard, about commanding attention. But what good was a loud voice if it didn't bring comfort or safety to those who depended on him? What good was admiration if it didn't translate to trust? A gentle breeze rustled the leaves above, and Gus closed his eyes, letting the cool air soothe his troubled mind. In the stillness of the evening, a memory surfaced, one of his early days on the farm. He had been a young, timid rooster then, unsure of his place among the other animals. Back then, it wasn't his crow that had given him courage. It was the warmth of the hens, the gentle nudges of the sheep, and the playful antics of the chicks. They had embraced him as one of their own, and in their acceptance, Gus had found his voice. But over time, he had forgotten those moments. He had allowed his pride to overshadow the connections that had once defined him. As the first stars began to dot the night sky, Gus made a silent vow. I will be more than a voice, he murmured. I will be someone they can count on, not just to wake the farm, but to care for it. The thought filled him with both fear and determination. He knew the path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. As the dawn broke over the horizon, painting the farm in soft hues of pink and orange, Gus hesitated to crow. His voice, once booming and proud, felt uncertain. Yet, summoning his courage, he let out a softer call, one that seemed to blend with the morning rather than command it. The farm stirred awake, but the usual energy was absent. The animals still avoided Gus, their trust in him shaken. Later that morning, Gus noticed a small, unfamiliar figure perched on the branch of the old oak tree. It was a sparrow, his feathers dulled by the dust of distant travels and his wings worn from countless journeys. The little bird seemed out of place among the farm's vibrant life. Yet his sharp eyes carried an unusual depth, as if he had seen far more than the world could offer. Curiosity drew Gus closer. "Who are you?" he asked, tilting his head. The sparrow hopped down to a lower branch, meeting Gus's gaze. "A traveler," he replied simply, his voice light but firm. "I have roamed many skies and rested in countless places. But today, I chose to stop here." "You seem troubled, young rooster." Gus hesitated. He had always presented himself as the farm's confident leader. Admitting his doubts to a stranger felt like exposing a fragile part of himself. But there was something calming about the sparrow's presence, as if his words carried no judgment, only understanding. "I'm supposed to be their leader," Gus began, his voice low. "I crow every morning to wake the farm, to remind them of the day's beginning. But when they needed me most, during the falcon's attack, I couldn't protect them. My voice wasn't enough, and now? They don't trust me anymore." The sparrow listened intently, his head bobbing slightly as Gus spoke. When the rooster finished, the sparrow let out a soft chirp that resembled a chuckle. "Oh, Gus," he said, "you've mistaken noise for leadership. A voice may wake the farm, but a heart earns its trust. Leadership isn't about being heard, it's about being felt." Gus blinked, unsure of the meaning behind the sparrow's words. "What do you mean by being felt?" The sparrow flitted down to the ground, gesturing with his wings toward the farm. "Look around you. The sheep graze together, not because one shouts directions, but because they trust each other to stay close. The hens guard their chicks, not because they were told to, but because they feel a bond of care. Leadership comes from connection, Gus, not command." The words struck a chord deep within Gus. He had always believed his crow was enough to lead, but he now realized he had never truly connected with the animals he claimed to lead. "But how do I change that?" he asked, his voice trembling. The sparrow gave a knowing nod. "You must start with your heart. Listen more than you speak. Care more than you command. Let them see that you are not above them, but with them." Gus pondered the sparrow's advice, his mind racing. The idea of leading with his heart rather than his voice felt both foreign and liberating. Before Gus could ask more, the sparrow spread his wings. "Remember, Gus," he said, lifting into the air. "A leader's voice may echo, but it is their heart that leaves an imprint." With that, he soared into the sky, disappearing beyond the trees. Gus stood in silence, the sparrow's words swirling in his mind. He realized that to regain the trust of the farm, he would need to change not just in his actions, but in the way he saw himself and the others. Gus awoke the next morning with a new resolve. As the golden rays of dawn bathed the farm, he climbed to his usual perch on the coop, but this time he paused. Instead of his usual triumphant crow, Gus took a deep breath and let out a softer, warmer call, a greeting rather than a command. The farm stirred, and though the animals rose as they always did, Gus noticed curious glances turned his way. Throughout the day, Gus began to act differently. Instead of watching the animals from a distance, he stepped down from his perch and mingled among them. At first, his presence was met with hesitation. The hens clucked nervously, and the sheep shuffled away, unsure of his intentions. But Gus persisted. He approached the wounded hen who had bravely protected her chicks during the falcon's attack. Lowering his head, Gus spoke gently. "I want to thank you," he said. "Your courage that day saved the chicks. I should have been there to help, but I wasn't." "I'm sorry." The hen blinked, her beady eyes studying him closely. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, with a small nod, she replied, "You can help now. We need to rebuild trust, not just among us, but with you." Her words humbled Gus, but they also gave him purpose. Over the next few days, he immersed himself in the farm's daily life. He helped the hens gather straw for their nests, stood watch with the dogs as they patrolled the grounds, and even joined the sheep in herding the lambs toward greener pastures. At first, his efforts felt clumsy. Gus, who had always relied on his voice, struggled to find ways to contribute with his actions. But as time went on, the animals began to warm to him. The hens clucked in appreciation when he helped guide a stray chick back to its nest. The dogs wagged their tails when Gus alerted them to a rustle in the bushes. Even the sheep began to graze more comfortably when Gus joined them in the fields. The change was not immediate or perfect, but it was genuine. Gus began to notice small moments of connection that he had never experienced before. a chick playfully pecking at his tail feathers, a sheep nudging him in thanks, a hen resting beside him in the shade, all signs that the animals were starting to see him not as an aloof leader, but as a part of their community. One evening, as the animals gathered under the old oak tree, Gus found himself in their midst. The sheep lay in a circle, the hens clucked softly, and even the pigs lounged contentedly nearby. Gus, for the first time, felt a sense of belonging he had never known. "It feels different, doesn't it?" came a familiar voice. Gus turned to see the sparrow perched on a low branch, watching him with keen eyes. "It does," Gus admitted. "I never realized how much I was missing." Leading from the heart. "It's harder than just crowing, but it's worth it," the sparrow nodded approvingly. "Remember, Gus, it's not about being perfect. It's about being present. When you lead with care, you don't just guide others, you grow with them." As the sparrow flitted away into the twilight, Gus felt a deep sense of peace. The farm had begun to heal, and so had he. His journey was far from over, but for the first time, Gus felt ready to face whatever came next, not as a solitary voice, but as a heart among many. The sun rose over the farm with a brilliance that seemed almost celebratory, casting long golden beams over the fields. Gus stood atop the coop once more, but this time his chest swelled not with pride, but with gratitude. As the farm stirred awake, he let out a crow not booming and commanding as it once was, but steady and heartfelt. The sound blended harmoniously with the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves, signaling a new beginning for the farm and for Gus himself. The animals gathered slowly in the yard, a sign of how the farm had changed in recent days. Gus descended from his perch to greet them. His presence now met with nods of recognition and even the occasional warm smile. The wounded hen, now recovered, stood close with her chicks huddled at her feet. The dogs wagged their tails in greeting, and the sheep bleated softly as they moved toward the pastures. A newfound unity had taken root among the animals, and Gus was at the center of it, not as a figure perched above them, but as one of them. He had learned to listen, to lend a wing when needed, and to truly care for those around him. Later that day, a group of sparrows darted across the sky, their silhouettes fleeting against the bright blue. Gus's thoughts returned to the wise sparrow who had guided him, and he whispered a silent thanks. The little bird's words had reshaped his understanding of leadership. Gus now realized that a leader's strength was not in the volume of their voice, but in the depth of their compassion. As the day unfolded, Gus continued his work alongside the other animals. He helped the hens mend their nests, stood watch with the dogs to keep the falcon at bay, and guided the lambs toward the freshest patches of grass. Each task strengthened the bond he shared with the farm, and the animals began to rely on him not just for his crow, but for his presence. That evening, as the animals gathered beneath the old oak tree, the atmosphere was light and joyful. The hens clucked softly, the sheep rested in clusters, and the pigs rolled lazily in the dirt. Gus perched on a low branch, watching the scene with a warmth in his chest that no crowing at sunrise had ever brought him. A young chick, curious and unsteady on its tiny legs, toddled up to Gus. "Why do you crow every morning?" the chick asked, tilting its head. Gus smiled, lowering himself to meet the chick's gaze. "I crow to wake the farm," he said, "but also to remind us all of the gift of another day to work, to play, and to care for one another." The chick chirped happily, satisfied with the answer, and scampered back to its mother. Gus watched it go, his smile lingering. He realized that his crow had found a new purpose, not as a symbol of his pride, but as a call to unity and gratitude. The night fell gently over the farm, and the animals settled into their places. Gus stood once more beneath the stars, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He had fallen, faltered, and doubted himself, but through it all, He had discovered the true meaning of leadership. The farm thrived not because of one voice, but because of many hearts beating as one. Gus understood now that to lead was not to command, but to inspire to lift others up by standing alongside them. As he closed his eyes, ready to rest, Gus felt a deep peace within him. He was no longer just the rooster who crowed at sunrise. He was Gus, the rooster who led with his heart,